Welcome to the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity convening on the state of family and economic opportunity policy. My name is Monique Garcia-Reiser. I'm a vice president at Friedman Consulting, which co-runs Spotlight with the Hatcher Group. Today's convening is a collaborative production of Spotlight and the team at American Policy Ventures. We are also really pleased today to have the support and partnership of the Doris Duke Foundation. So to kick off our day, we're excited to hear welcoming remarks from Jian Cheng, Program Director for Child Wellbeing at the Doris Duke Foundation. So with that, we'll get right to it, and I'll hand it over to you, Ju. Thank you.
Thanks, Monique. So I want to thank the entire Spotlight team, the folks at American Policy Ventures, and all of the panelists. And thanks to everyone for joining us today, making time in your busy schedules. Again, my name is Jian Cheng, and I'm the Director of Child Wellbeing at the Doris Duke Foundation. I want to just take a quick moment to tell you a little bit about Doris Duke and why conversations about child and family policy matter so much to us. The mission of the Doris Duke Foundation is to improve the quality of people's lives through grants, supporting the performing arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and child well-being, and through the preservation of the cultural and environmental legacy of Doris Duke's properties in New Jersey and Hawaii. I joined Doris Duke last year after spending over 20 years working on children's policy and practice at both the state and federal level. Most recently, I served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Administration for Children and Families at HHS, and immediately before that ran the child welfare and juvenile justice systems in the state of Michigan. From my time on the ground and in my conversations with human service directors across the country, I can confidently say that what the research tells us is true. Serious economic need itself causes negative child outcomes, especially when it begins early in childhood and or persists throughout a large share of a child's life. When I was in Michigan, we wanted to see if we could improve our service delivery system by studying where calls to the hotline and foster care entries came from so that we could concentrate our prevention programs where there was greatest need. What we found surprised me. The vast majority of the kids who came to the attention of the child welfare system were not concentrated to cities or towns, but to neighborhoods, city blocks that often overlapped with the greatest levels of economic need. Most calls were coming to us not because of abuse or neglect, but because these families had basic needs that teachers, doctors, and law enforcement did not know how to address, but also couldn't ignore. The good news is that we know there's a better way. Research tells us that many programs that support families either directly, by providing income transfers, or indirectly by providing food, housing, or medical care have been shown to improve child well-being. At Doris Duke, we're working with innovative jurisdictions to support family need before those needs turn into crisis. We're able to do so because jurisdictions are maximizing federal policies that you've worked so hard to pass, like the Family First Prevention Services Act, new child care funds, and home visiting programs to serve families upstream. We're also working with these jurisdictions to understand which families need flexible resources to stabilize during moments of economic shock when we know they are most vulnerable to child welfare involvement, either because parental stress is linked to increased risk of child maltreatment or because need is often conflated with neglect. At Doris Duke, we believe that all children deserve the opportunity to thrive in strong families and supportive communities. We also recognize that all families need help sometimes, and that although foundations can support innovation, policy is what matters, and policy that is bipartisan and the result of consultation, healthy debate, and compromise is both what the American people want and children and families need. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Kadia Goba, who is a politics reporter at Semaphore. Kadia covered Congress for Axios and BuzzFeed News before joining Semaphore, and in 2018, she was awarded the Pulitzer Center's Crisis Reporting Fellowship, which sponsored her travels to Sierra Leone to report on environmental strategies. Kadia, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to jump right in here and introduce our great panelists today. I'll start with Jennifer Chandler. If you could each individually just give a little bio of where you're coming from, which office you work in, your role in that office, it would be very helpful.
Hi, thank you so much, Kadia. My name is Jen Chandler. I'm Chief of Staff to Congressman Jim McGovern on the House side. He is also ranking member of the House Rules Committee and co-chair of the bipartisan House Hunger Caucus. I just hit 16 years with him, and for a lot of that, I have worked on his hunger and nutrition work, which I co-lead with one of my colleagues. I've also done healthcare and transportation for him. I'm originally from his district, and thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Jacob, you can go next.
Sure. I'm Jacob Reeses. I'm Chief of Staff to Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio. I worked previously as Senior Policy Advisor to Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. And these issues are very near and dear to all of my previous bosses and to myself.
Hi, my name is Neri Martinez. I am currently Chief of Staff to Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina. I was previously his staff director for the Committee on Aging when he served as ranking member in the last Congress. My boss has talked very frequently about growing up in a single mother home in a household in poverty, and these issues are very near and dear to him, and he is constantly working to try to find bipartisan solutions for families like the one that he grew up with.
Thanks, Neri. Stephen and then Scott can follow.
Hi, great to be with you all today. I work for a small government affairs firm called Porterfield, Fettig and Sears. But before that, I was with Senator Ron May leading his economic policy efforts. And as part of that, worked on the Family Security Act 1.0 and 2.0, which was his vision for how we could rework tax policy to better support families. Thanks.
Hey, it's Scott Fairchild. I'm Senator Cortez Masto's Chief of Staff, former campaign manager. I've been working for the senator for about 8 years. As folks may know, she's a first Latina in the United States Senate, and a member of the Finance Committee, which will hopefully be central in a lot of the discussion to come. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for doing this. Well, let's just get right into it. I'll start with, I'm a reporter, so I'm going to start with what's in the news right now. The debt limit has dominated the cycle. Work requirements are clearly a major stumbling block in the debt relief talks. I am curious, and I'll talk to you, Jennifer, first, because Rep. McGovern was just on the House floor just yesterday talking about this. Do you see potential compromises there or any other opportunities for maybe bipartisanship or bipartisan cooperation in other areas, maybe around the Farm Bill or food insecurities? I won't lead you, but like if you could give me some idea around that, where we can see some bipartisanship.
Thanks so much, Kadia. Look, I'll be honest and say in terms of work requirements and the debt negotiations, I find that really hard to imagine. My boss is adamantly opposed to any additional work requirements based on the fact that there already are work requirements for programs like SNAP, and a lot of the recent research coming out shows that they, quite frankly, have not been effective in increasing employment. That being said, I think when we move to Farm Bill, again, I don't think there's appetite for work requirements there, but I think there's certainly a lot of places, especially in Title IV, the nutrition title, where there are bipartisan, good faith bipartisan efforts to improve programs like nutrition incentives that incentivize healthy eating and produce prescriptions, that sort of thing, potentially expands or allow SNAP recipients to use their SNAP dollars on hot foods, those sorts of things. We're seeing those other kinds of policy changes as really ripe for bipartisan efforts going forward in the Farm Bill.
And the Farm Bill is expiring this year. Can you talk about when will we see negotiations start to ramp up there? If you have any clue around it.
That's an excellent question. I know that Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Scott have a portal recently that was opened where members and I think even outside groups can submit their priorities and recommendations for the Farm Bill. It's open through June 9th. I know a lot of conversations are happening behind the scenes, both with members in the committee, with staff, majority and minority, for the Ag Committee on the House. I obviously can't quite speak to the Senate side as well. But I know it's a priority for both sides. And we'll know when we know.
Thanks. Well, let me jump to the Senate side. Jacob, I know that Senator Vance has worked across the aisle on several bills in his inaugural year as a senator, from anything from catalytic converters to rail legislation. But separately, he's talking to some of his Senate colleagues about legislation on incentivizing childbirth. And I wanted to dig into that because my colleague at Semaphore, Joseph Zeballos-Roig, he gave him a really good quote, and he was just saying that it's just way too expensive to give birth these days. And where does that, so I'm curious, where does that legislation stand? Yeah, we'll start with that. Where does that stand?
So we've been doing a lot of work over this recess on that and having really productive conversations across the aisle about it. And one of the things that's really exciting about this problem is it's a problem that's just so obvious to so many people. And there's a really broad range of interest ideologically, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. And issues like this, people sometimes talk about a kind of horseshoe issue where you bring kind of way right, way left together. But this is even broader than that because the middle of both parties recognizes how common sense this is. So the big question is, how do you do this in a way that is not disruptive to care? How do you do it in a way that works for all of the stakeholders who are so critical for the economics of giving birth? And we think we've got some good ideas. I don't have news to make yet, but there will be more to come, and this is one of the highest priority initiatives for us.
You will see, I will constantly try to make news here. Can you talk about the ideological differences and how somehow they're coming to the same center on this?
Sure. So for a long time, and this is not just on the question of delivery, it's just more generally support for families. For people of my persuasion in the party, my boss's persuasion in the party, talking about this in the 2010s, it was less in vogue. We're obviously right now we're very concerned about debt also, but the idea of finding ways to illustrate Republican economic commitment to supporting families, it felt like one of many budget priorities rather than kind of the foremost priority. And that's really changed in the post-Trump period because of President Trump's reinvigoration of this debate. Obviously, the child tax credit was so critical to the broader tax reform efforts of the Trump administration. And so you now have, there's like a competition on the right to develop pro-family policy. Senator Rubio, Senator Hawley, Senator Romney. And so obviously there's a broad ideological range there. And even within, and I don't want to speak for Senator Romney, but Stephen, I'm sure, can speak to this, to see the evolution of Senator Romney's proposal from FSA 1.0 to 2.0, incorporating some of the feedback coming from different ideological constituencies in the party about work and the importance of work. It illustrates how those who are invested in this debate want to make this a broad coalition effort of the right to incorporate all the different strands of conservatism. And I think there's really ground for consensus there.
Thank you, Jacob. I have one more question, and then I'm going to move to Scott because I want him to chime in here. Can you give us some insight on how the senator how this idea came about for the senator?
So the most direct answer to that is he retweeted an article that he found very compelling. He's someone who reads broadly and comes from a background of having been invested in public policy debates while he was an investor. And he's a very pragmatic person. And so he sees a really well-argued argument, and it's persuasive to him. But more generally, he's got 3 young kids. And so he's seen personally how difficult it can be to, to go into the delivery room and you don't actually know what the out-of-pocket costs might be on the other side of that. That's not something that any woman giving birth wants to have to worry about while she's in the most delicate circumstance of her life. And birth should not be a financially terrifying event. There's all sorts of other stress involved there. And so, yeah, just as a young parent, it's a natural issue for him to focus on.
Scott, you want to chime in here and tell us the perspective coming from from the senator's point of view?
Yeah, sure. And I agree with Jacob. I think there is a lot of bipartisan space here along the horseshoe. Child tax cut is something that I think there's going to be a lot of bipartisan appetite for. I mean, obviously it's expensive, but the results from 2021 were pretty darn compelling. So hopefully, when negotiations start leading up to 2025 expiration, child tax cut will be a big part of that conversation. From Democrats' perspective, above $400,000 is about $1.4 trillion over 10 that can be used, and that can go towards a well-crafted CTC. My boss's perspective is, it's part of the reason she's on finance committee, is by far the best methods of fighting poverty, growing the middle class, are through a fair tax code. You look at the most effective programs for poverty fighting, they tend not to be government spending programs. A lot of them are actually giving people resources in a fair and equitable way. So you see that with Social Security, eliminating or reducing senior poverty in this country. You see that with the earned income tax credit for the working poor. You saw that for the 1-year window in 2021 with the child tax cut. So there's a lot of good opportunities there. And I think on CTC, look, it's expensive, it's challenging, but I do think there's an opportunity for bipartisan agreement on that in 2025. So thank you.
Sure. Neri, I'm going to have you chime in here specifically because, well, you work for a member who just announced the president, announced his candidacy for president, but also former President Trump kind of talked about this around the same time Vance tweeted or started talking in the halls about this. He named it like a baby bonus. Is that something you'll see on the campaign? I mean, particularly from your boss, but like just in general?
Well, I'm not on the campaign, but I'm not sure what you're referring to as the baby bonus related to the policy that Senator Scott has advocated for. Can you elaborate on your question?
No, so the question was, can you give us some of his perspective, considering another candidate running for president, former President Trump, also talked about baby bonuses. So I just wanted to get like a feel about some policy he might have, Tim Scott might have dealt with or introduced in the past related to birth or tax credits for birthing.
Well, I can tell you that the senator has really been a big advocate of childcare and development, so that once families do have children, they can support them. And so, having been raised by a single mother, this is an issue that really matters to him a lot. So there is bipartisan legislation around the childcare and development block grant. So the senator has pushed for legislation to expand this bipartisan piece to increase family eligibility for CCDBG, to ensure that an eligible family making less than 75% state median income pays no child care copay, that no eligible family has a copay greater than 7% of the income. He's pushed to improve reimbursement rates for child care providers so they can recruit and retain qualified staff, supported the education and professional development of child care staff, expanded the supply and capacity of child care providers, and tried to remove unnecessary regulations that restrict home-based child care providers in rural areas, so that it becomes easier for families to raise children and take care of them and provide them their needs. And that is mostly bipartisan legislation, but the senator has pushed for those specific initiatives, quite frequently.
Well, while I have you, I want to talk about opportunity zones because I think that's very family focused. And Senator Tim Scott has been a huge advocate, introduced the bill, got it passed with the former president. And just for those of you who don't know, opportunity zones are financial incentives for businesses to develop in impoverished neighborhoods. Late last year, 2 economists wrote about the program and how much it helped. And I think they recorded nearly 4,000 communities from mid-2018 to 2020. Now, I am curious. I understand the senator is quite busy now, but I am curious if there's a follow-up phase to all of this, especially around some of the criticism related to gentrification. Is there a phase 2 to this grant program that he introduced?
Yeah, I think that first off, I just wanted to highlight some key points related to opportunity zones. Forbes came out with an article just today highlighting some of the benefits of opportunity zones. And in South Carolina, we have approximately 135 zones. And so $48 billion has been invested in 4,000 opportunity zones across every state. And that was by the end of 2020. And so what you're seeing is that these specific areas where development has helped to bring the economy up to speed, and this could be rural areas, this could be urban areas. Opportunity zones are designated by the governor. So I think that that's an important piece to understand. And so opportunity zones is the senator's signature piece of legislation. It was passed as part of the Tax and Cuts Jobs Act of 2017 under the previous administration. And since then has spurned $50 billion of private capital investment into low-income areas. So this piece of legislation specifically targets the areas that need development, that will benefit from increased jobs and increased property development to better the neighborhoods. And these were areas that were severely distressed before and did not have any economic opportunity. And so this piece of legislation helps everyone sort of lift up out of poverty. It has a lot of bipartisan support, not only on the federal side, because we worked with Senator Cory Booker quite closely for opportunity zones, but Democratic mayors, governors, and even other members of Congress support it. But the opportunity zones are designated by the governor of every state. So where you might see opportunity zones designated would have been designated by the governor. They're not designated by the senator. But this is something that he's very proud to have worked on. There is legislation to extend the program and improve upon the program. And we are hoping to get a lot of bipartisan support for that. But yes, I think that this particular piece of legislation has done an enormous benefit to try to help families all across the nation.
Can you give us some insight as to what that new legislation looks like?
Well, the legislation is actually still in draft form coming out of the Finance Committee. So, there isn't anything specific that we're looking at, but we are pushing to try to extend the initiative. And we're looking at various options to make it even better, to continue the bipartisan support for this.
Thank you, Neri. I want to go to you, Stephen. Let's talk about, and I know this was touched on a little bit earlier, child tax credits. This has been sort of a marquee piece of ledge for Senator Romney. And we're here. Well, people are already asking about an extension past 2025. So can you give me some insight? People want to know if it'll be renewed, at what levels, things like that. Can you talk us through some of that, please?
Yeah, sure. So I know you're alluding to the 2025 cliff where the child tax credit that was doubled in the 2017 Trump tax law expires and will revert back to $1,000. I think it's a great question and a really open question right now on what actually happens. My perspective is that it is going to, at the very least, be renewed, but I would suspect potentially increase. I think a big portion of Senator Romney's interest in this was looking at kind of the maze of how many tax credits we actually have for family, how much spending we do for family, and trying to sort of reorient them and not have them compete against one another, but be crafted in a way that families can sort of easily understand what they're going to receive, when they're going to receive it, and why they're going to receive it. So I think it's an open question. I think it's a huge piece of the pie to get any sort of deal done. And I think that's true if it's a split Congress. I think it's true if it's a Republican Congress. I mean, a lot of you will remember in 2017 when Republicans did have full control of Congress, child tax credit was kind of the linchpin of how you were going to finally get this thing over the finish line. And that was because of really Senator Rubio and Senator Lee at the time, who were pushing and saying that they weren't going to vote for a deal unless they got an expanded child tax credit in there. I think the numbers of Republican senators, especially who are interested in expanding the CTC, has only grown. And I suspect that they would probably take a similar narrative and position that Rubio and Lee did. But it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Can we get a little bit into the compromise around CTC and what that means? You can go, Stephen, and I'll hit up Scott after that.
Sure. Like what do I think a potential bipartisan compromise is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think a lot of it depends, obviously, what the elections look like in 2024. From my perspective, and we've had a lot of great conversations with our friends across the aisle, over the last few years. I think that the question on whether or not you have a work requirement in the child tax credit has been definitively decided. There will be a work requirement. And you can quote me on this. I would bet all my life savings that there's not going to be no work requirement in whatever happens in 2025. So I think it really, again, depends on who you're talking to, because I think for most Republicans, especially Republicans that are interested in the child tax credit, they're so far past the question of should we have a work requirement in this program that they're looking at kind of the mechanics of, hey, if we raise this here or we increase the phase-in rate, what are we doing with the earned income child tax credit? Do we start bringing that into the discussion? I think, and again, I'm speaking with a Republican hat here on, I think for Democrats, they're still kind of having a little bit of that inner war of when do you sort of acknowledge that ARPA probably was just a one-year snapshot of a really unique policymaking time. And that's not going to carry through in 2025. And how do they sort of come out of that? And I don't know, that'd be a better question for Democrats than me, but I certainly hope, I think there is going to be some sort of compromise on one, increasing the actual value. And then I think two, expanding it to low-income families, which is something that was done in 2017. And I think a lot of Republicans would support that now.
That was my next question for you before I went on to Scott. Do you think it should be a universal item, means tested or available to everyone?
I don't, no.
Just an extension to low income families is your point.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you asking if it should be universal or?
Correct.
Okay, so I think that's actually an interesting question. If you're asking if there should be a work requirement, I think yes, absolutely. I think that's in the name. That's why the child tax credit was created. It was to offset tax liability. When you start talking about a universal credit, that's a check being handed out, that's not a tax credit. It's very, very different. Would I support the child tax credit going to sort of like middle upper income families? Absolutely, 100%. I think for a few different things. I think one, they're raising our children's that are going to be leading the country down the road. The financial burden that they are taking on in order to do that is significantly larger than a $2,000 or even $3,000 tax credit. And I think it's a good way to distinguish within our tax code and acknowledge the societal benefit that we get from families raising children. It creates, diversity in the community. I think it creates innovation. I think it creates a more sustainable path forward. If you even look at like our trust funds, that they are actually paying into Social Security because they're raising kids who are going to grow up and work, and then they're going to pay for hopefully my Social Security one day. So yeah, absolutely. I think it should continue to be expanded. I think it'll be challenging because it has been popular since 2017. I think it will be really challenging in 2025 to try to argue why you should be raising taxes on families that do have kids.
Thanks, Stephen. And Scott, can you just give me some perspective coming from the senator on the issue of child tax credits before I run over to Michelle?
Yeah, sure. I think largely agree with Stephen that it should be wide. I think we would disagree with it being unlimited. I think most Democrats would disagree with it being unlimited, but I think it being really getting a lot of bang for our buck with both helping the working poor, but extending it well into the middle class. So it's a pretty widely available benefit, I think, is the direction that more moderate Democrats like my boss would go. You know, from the left, there'll be pushes for you know, a lot of other spending. I think my boss really feels like child tax credit should be a top priority, and that there's a way to shape it. You know, obviously there'll be negotiations over work requirements. I agree with some of the comments in the chat. It's not always the best solution, but that's going to be part of the bipartisan compromise. And then I think we've got to, you know, there has to be an upper income limit to it as well. I mean, to help keep the cost a little more manageable. But you know, if you squint, I think there's a deal to be had. I think there's enough people in both parties that think that, you know, this could be a really helpful measure to both eliminate or dramatically reduce child poverty, but also really help middle class, working class families. So I think there's a deal to be had.
I want to move to, we keep talking about work requirements. So I want to talk about, talk to Michelle about, I know Reps Houlihan and Bice actually are leading this bipartisan effort on paid leave. And we know the effort was thwarted during Build Back Better, and then again during the IRA. What gives you the sense that it's going to go anywhere this time?
I'm actually quite optimistic. In the 116th Congress, we were able to get paid leave for paid parental leave for federal workers. In the 117th, we were able to get paid parental leave for members of our armed services. And those were both done on a bipartisan basis. There is still a whole lot of work to do on this front in both of those areas. We only have 25% of American workers today have access to leave, so lots of work to still be done. But you know, we're now here on hopefully the third Congress where we can in a row make progress on this. We're starting from scratch. Rep Bice is a really great partner. She is just as committed as my boss is, Chrissy Houlihan. And we have not just outside stakeholders who care deeply, who are working with us on this. We have also, I know I'm going to brag on our staff. We have a really great staff. Chrissy hires well. We've got Emma Zaffron, who maybe some of you know, who is actually brings expertise to our office in this area. That's not always common on the House side. I know it's very common on the Senate side, less so on the House. And so I think we've got just the right mix of momentum, bipartisanship, people in our office, on the Hill, and outside in the community who care deeply about this. And so far, I feel really optimistic about the meetings that we've had and the things that we are assembling.
Jacob, I know that Sanders and Gillibrand introduced legislation around this. Curious if they've reached out or if there's any bipartisanship in that end on the Senate side.
I don't want to say no one on our staff has ever heard from them in case there's a conversation I'm not aware of, but I'm not aware of such a conversation. My boss has spoken to this question, though, and has expressed some skepticism of paid leave as the main thrust of a pro-family agenda. And the reason for that is I have my 10th college reunion this weekend, and there are going to be a lot of new parents in my class, and it'll be really exciting to see them. Lots of dual income families that really struggle with paid leave. And it seems for such people like, you know, this is the most obvious thing in the world. And of course, it is an obvious need, and it's a need well worth our trying to figure out how to address. But there are a lot of people who don't fall into that family structure. There are a lot of families with a stay-at-home dad or stay-at-home mom who also need support, because when you only have one income stream in the house rather than two, especially if you live in a part of our country where housing costs are really high, other costs are really high, you need support too. You're working really hard at home with the kid. And so there's a way in which you can synthesize the desire to support paid leave for working parents with the more general desire to support parents. And I think you see in some of Senator Rubio's efforts, for example, on paid leave, a desire to try to make this family structure agnostic, which is going to be really important for making the paid leave conversation a truly bipartisan one. Because if it is not family structure agnostic, you're going to leave a lot of families that work really hard to raise their kids on one income out in the cold.
Neri, any insight on where Senator Scott stands on this?
Yeah, I think that, it's probably not the only solution out there. And so this has been a priority for us in terms of supporting the family. We do have a number of other initiatives that do support the family. But I think that there is always bipartisan solutions to different areas related to leave, related to families, related to the economic support of families. I think this is one of those issues where maybe Republicans, Democrats, would like to come together on a lot of different areas, but they don't always agree on exactly the execution of, how to approach paid leave in a bipartisan fashion. So it's one of those issues where there isn't, a full 100% consensus for a solution. Although I think that Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans, including my boss, understand that we agree on a problem, even if we approach the solution differently.
Thanks. Jennifer, didn't mean to leave you hanging there. Can we talk about, I know he introduced the food waste bill. Can we talk about that a bit?
Sure. That was the Food Donation Improvement Act, was a bipartisan bill that my boss introduced last Congress, and it was passed in a chaotic fashion, as normally happens at the end of a Congress, right before the omnibus. And it helps sort of clarify the rules around donating perfectly good but unused food. So from a business, for example, there's some the bill provides some additional clarity on liability protections. We had been hearing from retailers, and especially small retailers who may not have a sort of big legal team to rely on, or small farmers, about the liability protections there, as well as enables them to donate directly to individuals as opposed to through sort of a third party organization. So we were thrilled to get that done at the end of last year. It was also a priority that came out of the national strategy from the White House Conference on Hunger, Health, and Nutrition that my boss was a huge champion of for many years. So that was, and it was bipartisan. We were thrilled to work with Congresswoman, the late Congresswoman Jackie Walorski on that. My boss and she were great friends, both personally and professionally.
I actually remember when Pelosi endorsed the food, having it at the White House. So I remember that. Okay, so there are a lot of questions on work requirements from the audience. This one is from Erin Melton. When it comes to work requirement, the work requirement debate, I would love some insight into the continued insistence from one party that we need them when there is so much evidence that not only do they not work, but they are also actively counterproductive to the anti-poverty upward mobility goals of programs like SNAP and TANF. Who wants to take this?
I can jump in.
Be my guest, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. I would probably disagree with the premise. I think some of the problem that has happened in the discussion in this debate is both sides kind of no work requirement, pro work requirement. They all have their own respective studies. I think no work requirement has their Columbia study, pro work requirement has their University of Chicago study. It's also challenging because when you talk about a work requirement, that means something very different in what program we're talking about. Child tax credit, like I talked about before, is tax liability. We've talked about a work requirement for Medicaid, that's healthcare. You're talking about SNAP. I think we should actually come to those and view them distinct from one another rather than sort of one mass universal approach to how we think about work requirements. I think that's the first of it. And then I think the second, I can say this is, working for someone who publicly sort of like way back and forth on what we should do with a work requirement. I think at the end of the day, and I think a lot of academic research will support this, it's a mixed bag. I think if you hand out money to families who are not working, they have no connection to the workforce, particularly for a long period of time, there's some really bad consequences to that. And that's a trade-off that you have to acknowledge. And I think in other situations, absolutely, I think it can provide a floor of stability for some families. But I don't think that that is the end all be all for how you're going to help lift families out of poverty. And we've had a national debate about this really for the last 25 years. I think what's interesting is the sort of insistence that we don't have a work requirement for the child tax credit is really a new recent phenomenon. Even if you go back to 2016 and look at Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign and her child tax credit proposal, it looks pretty darn similar to what Marco Rubio put out. And then you fast forward 4 years later, and we had a contentious Democratic primary where the child tax credit did get brought up and candidates were really split on it. Even President Biden never campaigned on it in the general. In fact, they released a white paper in September 2020 that sort of just had a footnote in there that I know a lot of activists were really, really pumped about, but that just wasn't something he campaigned on. And then I think the politics of COVID so quickly shifted expectations for a debate that we really have actually had, I think, in good faith on both sides for a really long time, that we're now kind of getting back to that reset period. That when you ask Americans, particularly, and that's where I think it's important to distinguish between something like healthcare versus handing out checks. When you ask Americans, do you support handing out checks with no strings attached? The vast majority say no. And I think that's what constituents want. And I think we saw that just with the American Rescue Plan, that we did have a 1-year trial for it. I think some of the studies that are pointed to from that trial, I really don't give a lot of emphasis on, because it was a 6-month period where they were doing monthly checks. And it was in the middle of COVID when money was just showering out of the sky. So I don't think families actually really understood what was happening here. So I think we're getting back into a reset, but I think it's a good question. And there's a lot of sort of historical data and analysis on the debate about work requirements.
Another work requirement question. Is there any discussion around the definition of work requirements to include work as parents being enrolled in school full-time, for instance, or just finishing their college degree, or even enrolled part-time? Scott, you want to take this?
No, I was just gonna, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna jump in and say, I'm not aware of that being sort of a serious element of the discussion or debate at the moment. I know that certainly, I think, kind of come up from time to time over the years, but I mean, you have, even at the moment, college students need to be enrolled, or now that the end of the public health emergency, college students will now, in order to get SNAP, will need to be enrolled or need to be working at least part-time to get the benefit. So I think there's a couple of sort of layers of that education or enrolled in higher ed discussion here that, at least to my knowledge, is not sort of a serious part of the conversation at the moment.
Would everyone concur with that?
Well, I mean, so I'm not an expert on how in the TANF reauthorizations over the years, how this question has been resolved. I know that it's often a really, really complicated and extremely controversial one among welfare program administrators. But the fact that it's so complicated, I think, is illustrative of why this is an important question when you talk about the CTC and whether CTC needs to account for this or not. Because there is a whole policy architecture administered state to state that really well-meaning welfare administrators have worked really hard on over the years, and they're trying to just get the balance of this stuff right. And if you design a policy of family support in such a way that it is going to crowd out the income thresholds on which that whole architecture depends, then you have a lot of unintended consequences of a really finely tuned welfare machine. Arguably, if you're a supporter of the way that we do welfare administration in this country, to the extent that we have workfare, gets blown out. And given how important welfare reform is to the self-understanding of the right, I mean, if you want successful family policy, you want the Heritage Foundation on board. And this is key to the Heritage Foundation's self-understanding is one of the major victories of that institution. And you would not want any new family support policy to just crowd out the income thresholds that are critical to the design of that whole architecture.
I have two questions on child tax credit. The first one is there an opportunity for any improvement in child tax credits in 2023 in the context of the R&D tax credit? Or the second question is, or do panelists think the CTC might be paid monthly again?
I can say, I think we already sort of saw the debate play out about the R&D tax credit and the child tax credit last December. That did not go well if you were advocating for expanding the child tax credit. The premise that I'm aware of is still that it would be a fully refundable child tax credit to trade for the R&D credit. I don't think that that has a chance of going anywhere at all. I think it would be more interesting if there was a discussion about slightly tweaking, maybe increasing the phase-in rate or something for the child tax credit for R&D. But I think at the end of the day, when you look at the R&D credit and what's kind of held it back from bringing along family policies, the R&D credit's bipartisan and it's got a really long history. And it's not some sort of like new corporate cut that I think Republicans have dreamed up. It's something that has a lot of support across the aisle. So I don't think it makes sense to hold that hostage with the child tax credit. The more interesting discussion that has been happening is, well, what if you tie that with something like LIHTC and housing? And that's also a bipartisan bill. I would say I kind of call like R&D a Republican bipartisan bill, and I would call LIHTC a Democrat bipartisan bill, if that makes any sense. I think that's kind of a more interesting trade that also, I think if you're focusing on housing, that's going to help families, particularly low-income families, and has a much better path forward. I just don't see CTC and R&D working.
I'm glad you brought up housing. I want to talk about if there's any conversation happening in the space of housing, related to families. But I also want to talk about the pandemic. And before I get to housing, I'm going to talk to Scott, because I know the senator has a new bill. I think she did. She teamed up with Cornyn on a bipartisan bill to access mental health care for families. I imagine there's a greater sense of urgency now that the pandemic is over and we're recovering. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the mental health crisis, I mean, it was exacerbated by the pandemic, but we've right now, physical health care and telehealth rules, I think, were changed dramatically during the pandemic, and it's good to see that a lot of those telehealth rules are not going back to, the rubber band has been stretched. We're not going back to the way we were pre-pandemic, which for, as we call it in Nevada, Indian country, the 28 tribes in Indian country, for rural healthcare. But even in urban areas, we want telehealth to be accessible, and I think that bridge to mental health is valuable as well. There's also, seems to be very clear that with mental health, telehealth helps reduce the stigma. You're not going to like a crowded waiting room in a in a hospital or clinic setting where, you know, you might recognize people. So there's a lot of benefits to it. And I think cutting that red tape, making sure that telehealth stays vibrant post-pandemic is, you know, something that I think everyone can get behind.
Scott, is there anything related to children coming out of the pandemic, some focus related to children, or any of you can answer this, but we saw that like the public school system virtually shut down, right? Unless you were, you know, had access to online services. So I'm curious if there's any talk about, you know, closing the gap for some of those children or students.
I can jump in here. Senator Scott has been one of the leaders on trying to promote education for children. He believes that education is the closest thing to magic in America, and that all children, no matter their zip code, should have access to a high quality education because it's the great equalizer to try to lift students out of multi-generational poverty. We did look at a number of different situations post pandemic to try to correct some of the learning gaps that we saw, particularly in math and science, because of a result of school closures during the pandemic. And we introduced the Kids in Classes Act, which would allow eligible families to use Title I educational dollars to access alternative forms of education in the event that their child's assigned school stopped offering in-person learning due to COVID or a collective bargaining action. We've done some other bipartisan solutions as well. We introduced the bipartisan Enhancing Mental Health and Suicide Prevention through Campus Planning Act. That's more for higher institutions, but we did see an increase in mental health and suicide rates as a result of the pandemic. And this bipartisan bill provides increased coordination between federal agencies and higher education institutions to develop and implement mental health and suicide prevention plans. And so there are a number of different other bills that we've done in ourselves, but this last one is probably the biggest one bipartisan that would try to tackle the gaps there because of the pandemic.
I would just add, similarly, we had a bill in the House last session that did pass but didn't ultimately get signed into law, that was studying global learning loss and trying to figure out where the gaps are. I think thankfully lots of people are looking at this, thought it was important for the federal government to do it too, and then to come up with ways to address it. So we care, we're trying. It hasn't, it has not yet become law.
Michelle, is there an opportunity to bring that back, reintroduce it this Congress?
I think so.
And while I'm here with you, can you talk about housing, something we didn't touch on a lot outside of opportunity zones? Is there anything, are there any conversations in that space right now?
I think the expression on my face says not a lot. It's a crisis. We know it's a crisis. Housing is expensive. And it is so there's so many causes for that, and there's so many ways to tackle it. It is multidimensional, and there's no easy, I've been a chief for 10, 11, 12 years, and we've been talking about this since I've been here. Lots of proposals. I'm not hearing a lot right now, honestly.
I know, as a New Yorker, I remember Richie Torres bringing it up and as a freshman, and I'm pretty sure he's going to do the same thing this year. I mean, can you talk about what it would take to get, people talking about it?
Well, get past the debt ceiling, for starters. I mean, you've got issues around construction and permitting and lending. I think I will say, for starters, it's not something we hear a lot about it, but we don't hear a lot about it when we're in the community, in the sense of, like, we don't get, it's obviously top of mind, but so is inflation and the prevalence of AI and disinformation, and people are worried about what's going to have can our system, will our system hold for the election in 2024? Like there are all these other things which we seem to have a higher intensity level that we do hear about. Gun violence, women's reproductive rights. Housing is important for sure. It's a national crisis. You can talk to anybody, but somehow it's always like, I don't know, like number 9 out of a long list of things. I don't know how I'm not sure how you change that. I'm sorry.
Jacob, no,
Katia.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that Michelle raises some really good points about the importance of housing and the importance of needing to prioritize it. I know it's just brand new and it's just a discussion draft, but if helpful, I just wanted to raise the point that the senator, as the ranking member of banking, oversees housing in the Senate as part of that committee. And just last month, the senator released a discussion draft. Sorry, I have this light that turns off. It's timed, but hopefully you can still see me here. Last month, the senator released a discussion draft of his road to housing. And this was specifically to solicit input from both sides of the aisle on how to best craft a common sense bipartisan housing bill. The current draft calls for a focus on competition and innovation in the housing sector, investments in solutions that deconcentrate poverty and help families be self-sufficient, the removal of restrictive regulatory burdens that limit the production and preservation of more affordable housing, and to think about how it cuts red tape. So it is called the Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream Road to Housing Act. And its intent is to try to find areas where both the left and the right can consider common sense fixes and fix some of the housing problems, that we both know exist, and try to find common sense solutions to these issues. And we look forward to trying to work with, anyone who has good ideas on this to try to address housing while he's doing this as a ranking member of the Banking Committee.
And Neri, I know it's just a white paper at this point, but have you reached out to people? Is there an appetite? Do you hear that there's an appetite in the Senate for this kind of?
Yeah. This particular piece of legislation is being handled mostly by the Banking Committee and the Banking Committee staff because it's under the jurisdiction of his ranking membership there. But I think we're always talking to people to try to figure out how we can find common sense solutions to problems that we all understand need to be priority. I'm going to try to get this light on here. Thank you.
Thank you. Jacob, can I ask you about if there are any proposals in the making or around childcare at this point on the Senate side? On
childcare, I know there's a whole constellation of childcare proposals. I couldn't tell you that there's going to be action anytime. I mean, we've barely done anything in the Senate this year, so I couldn't tell you there's something that's really at a stage of incubation where it's going to happen. But
have you seen senators have a specific appetite for anything specific based on everything we've talked about today?
Here's how I guess how I would put it on the broad set of issues. It's really exciting for my boss to be a new member here and to come to these debates when they're at a state of maturity, when you have options rather than there's one idea. There's a spectrum of different ways you can approach these issues, and he gets to talk to colleagues who have been working really hard at this for years, rather than these being questions of first impression for everyone. These are live debates where they have clear contours. And so he's really enjoyed getting to hear the broad range of views on all these questions. And I'd add to that housing. I mean, I'm going to send Neri an email right now about getting together with her team, because my boss has enjoyed being on the Banking Committee under Senator Scott's leadership. And it's going to be an interesting year on the housing question, given what Senator Scott's working on. So Neri, I'll shoot you that email right now.
Awesome. This is working out already. So appreciate the conversation. This is great.
Look at us bringing offices together in real time. I have one last a question from the audience. There's been talk about how these issues play out across the aisle, but what about across the country? Given that poverty rates are different in different paths of the country, is there a struggle to create one umbrella-like fix? I know that is an issue with like API in New York City. So I am curious, yeah, how do you guys muster that to kind of coalesce around? How do you get senators in a room to talk about a lot of these issues when it's very different in New York City versus like maybe Nebraska or Nevada? Jennifer, why don't you go?
Ooh, calling me out. Thanks. And the question nobody wanted to answer. No, I mean, I think, look, it's right. That's the beauty of this country, is that there's so much diversity on a whole bunch of different measures and characteristics. And I think these are, this kind of question, this, 30,000 foot question, if you will, on how we come together on some of the most sort of challenging issues, is one that, I mean, basically since our founding, we've, gone through ebbs and flows and tried to figure out, and, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't, and sometimes it's a long slog. But I think for my boss, it's, obviously he's a progressive Democrat, but he is constantly talking to his colleagues, both, within his caucus and across the aisle and his line is always, we don't have to agree on everything to agree on something. And the something that we can agree on, let's try to move forward on. And sometimes that process is a little messy and there's ups and downs. But I think it's really just about, getting individuals and members of Congress and senators in the room, having these conversations, and let's see what's possible. And you got to start somewhere. So I think that's, especially how he approaches it.
I'd like to add something really quick to that. I think the work that we're doing on the bipartisan paid leave working group is a really good example of that. We've got 6 members, bipartisan, representing different parts of the country, different demographics, urban, rural. Paid leave, you're asking about momentum earlier. Paid leave polls better than the CCTC. 6, actually, there are 11 states across the country which have are pursuing their own policies and have paid leave programs in place. Our task force has already met with 6 of them to try to figure out how they're doing it. We've met with small businesses, we've met with insurance companies. We're actually meeting, next meeting is with employers who cross state lines. So we are just in a data gathering mode. And I think if you take all of these different perspectives, bipartisan, rural, urban, we will come up with something that it may not, not everyone's going to love it, but we might, I still feel optimistic that we can come up with something that is workable.
Well, that explains why you sound so optimistic, Michelle. I'm going to close with a lightning round. I'm going to ask, I guess I'll ask everyone, what's the biggest accomplishment you think this Congress will pass on family policy? I'll start with you, Neri.
The question is, what's the biggest accomplishment that we can pass by this Congress? Yeah, I think that we have to wait to see where we are on things, to see where we can find the biggest accomplishment. I mean, I think that there are a number of leaders like my boss who are always willing to work across the aisle and willing to work with members of, both parties and bicamerally to try to find solutions to the problems that we all face. I think that there's lots of opportunities and ideas on the table, and we'll just have to wait to see how the Congress plays out to see what the biggest accomplishment can be. But I'm hoping that we can always be part of the solution.
Okay, no bets from Neri. Scott, you want to go?
Yeah, by far our biggest accomplishment, this Congress will be avoiding default. That's really going to move the ball forward. But beyond that, I think really next Congress, 2025 is where the bipartisan deal on family policy is. That's where the action is going to be. Fortunately,
Anything
unfortunately.
specifically? Anything?
I think the 2025 tax cuts, all this work in the finance space around the tax code I think there's some pieces where moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans could get together in 2025, especially as, you know, tax codes are sunsetting, or as tax cuts are sunsetting, that focuses the mind. I think that's going to be, you know, that's what the preparation we're doing this Congress for next Congress.
Thanks, Stephen. It's on.
Yeah, I agree with what Scott said. I would say probably the only thing, and I don't want to say I predict it will happen, but I think has a chance, is some sort of very skinny housing package and a tax extender deal.
I'm sorry, and a tax what?
In a end of year tax extender deal.
Jennifer?
I mean, I think I agree with what Scott said and what Stephen alluded to. I mean, I think there is certainly, you know, the space for conversations around those things. I will say, you know, for this Congress, you know, if we move on a farm bill, I mean, I think there is some opportunity for some, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small but important bipartisan efforts that can go in there, you know, again, kind of in expanding nutrition incentives, or you know, providing some additional support in some of those kinds of programs. Kind of small in the grand scheme of things, but I know there's bipartisan support and could make a real difference in people's lives.
Thanks. Lightning round, Michelle, your turn.
I think right now, as I said, only 25% of American workers have access to paid leave. I think by the end of this Congress, that number will be higher.
And last but not least, Jacob.
I've got a dark horse. FAA reauthorization might be an interesting opportunity for some conversations about how to make it easier for families to ride planes together. Beyond that, I think the passage of the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act will keep families safe from train derailments, and that's something we'll all be able to celebrate.
Great way to close. And Liam, I'll kick it over to you. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks, Kadia, for moderating this great discussion. And thank you to all of the panelists for taking the time out of their busy days on the Hill to talk with all of us about family policy and economic opportunity. I'll just be very brief here to close up. I would like to both sort of talk about the path forward and then also share some of the events that the folks who put this event together have coming up later on. First off, I just want to say, by way of brief introduction, again, my name is Liam DeClivelo. I serve as the co-founder and co-president of American Policy Ventures. Our work in this mirrors a lot of exactly the conversation that you all have heard take place on this Zoom call. We know that there's a lot of advocacy on a lot of these kinds of issues on the left, and that exists as a very mature ecosystem. As folks like Jacob on the call were mentioning, there's a building ecosystem of this on the right now, which is fantastic. The focus of our team over the last number of years has been to work directly with members of both parties, including some of the people on this call. And I see a lot of the staffers' names in the participants list. We're trying to work with members of both parties with offices on both sides of Capitol Hill to actually help them find some of these things, stitch together some sort of cross-partisan agreement, and try to move something forward. And I think both from the insights you've heard in the discussion, and from things that we've heard and gleaned from our work on the Hill over the last number of years and the last couple of months, I think there's a case for grounded optimism, and that's the thing that I wanted to leave everyone with. And I think there's a couple particular reasons for that. One is that you're seeing a real rising tide from different parts of the Republican Party. From look at the folks represented on this call, right? Senator Romney, Senator Vance, Senator Scott. We're seeing a rising tide of Republicans for a number of different reasons, concentrating on how do we support and benefit the family? How do we incentivize building the family? How do we make the family the center of not just American life, but of American policymaking? And so that's one really positive trend. I think on the Democratic side, I think that very frankly, and this is something that we were involved in, I think that there is, and we've heard it on this call too, there's a growing realization that the partisan approach is not going to work, right? There were large numbers of sort of partisan attempts at doing things like paid leave, like the child tax credit in reconciliation and Build Back Better in 2021 and early 2022. depending on which side of the aisle you sit on, for better or for worse, that did not succeed. And so now there's sort of a level of forced bipartisanship on these issues, which hopefully will lead to more durable policy. And then I think the last two reasons for optimism also that were mentioned in this discussion were the fact that, as Scott pointed out, there in the calendar upcoming, there's going to be action forcing mechanisms happening, right? So the expiration of certain tax provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from TCJA in 2025 is one of those, is the obvious one, where there's going to be some sort of big tax policy conversation occurring anyway in a bipartisan fashion. And so that'll be an opportunity to try to get some wins on the board for a lot of the people on this Zoom. And then the final reason is that I think we're seeing more bipartisan working groups sprout up on this issue. We saw a lot of successful bipartisan working groups on different issues in 2022. And I think credit to Michelle and Congresswoman Houlihan and Congresswoman Bice, who's not represented on this call, for their work leading a House working group on trying to address in a creative and innovative way how it is you help parents in particular be able to spend time with their newborn kids, whatever those exact solutions might look like. And so those are all, at least for me personally, for our team, and I think coming out of this conversation, the reasons why we are optimistic, at least in a practical way, about where there's small but significant opportunities to get things done in a bipartisan way over the next couple of years. With that said, I just want to wrap up by mentioning that there are a few events that I want to point out that are being put together. I should thank the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity for helping put together this event with us, with American Policy Ventures. I also want to thank the Doris Duke Foundation for helping support this event and make sure that it happens successfully. There's a few events that are upcoming. The first event that I want to mention to everyone is actually just later this afternoon, if you happen to have time for another virtual event. It's an event being hosted by the Urban Institute and the Berkeley Opportunity Lab. They'll be talking about their research on the 2021 CTC expansion. That's today at 2 p.m. Either the link will be dropped in the chat for everyone to see, or you can go to the Urban Institute website to join that event later today at 2 p.m. Secondly, we have another event that's upcoming on June 13th, which has not yet been publicly announced, but official announcement will be coming out shortly. The event will be discussing research from the Baby's First Years project, which is a randomized controlled trial looking at some form of a child allowance to low-income families and what the effects of those were for children in their first years. So that event will be announced. There'll be information. All of you will receive that. That will be occurring on June 13th. We should have some special guest speakers for that as well. So with that, last thing I'll mention is that for any of you who have friends or colleagues or fellow Hill staff who didn't get to join this event, there will be a recording of this event on the Spotlight website, as you see on your screen. So with that, thank you all again so much for joining. Thanks once again to our panelists, to Kadia for moderating, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next event. Thank you so much.